Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So after listening to my interview with Murray and our discussion of what is happening and with Soltec and why is that an important piece of how are we going to solve some of the food issues going forward, that's where we want to take a pause. And so one of the things that I created was C6 Infrastructure Partners, which is a private equity fund firm that is investing in three overarching energy infrastructure. But the three core pieces is baseload electricity, food, fertilizer, as well as in diesel and refining. And it's interesting because when you look at those mixtures, we have to highlight that energy infrastructure is short. So in 2019, our view was we were going to be short power, so go out and buy baseload electricity. We were going to be short food, so go out and find a fertilizer companies, or other types of initiatives to improve soil health, yield, livestock, to fix that. And then the diesel side is there's no way that we are building a new oil refiner in the US, Canada, but there's a lot of opportunities to take, and again, back to the first point about food shortages, to take cellulose that is forestry waste as well as farm waste and turn that into renewable diesel and biochar. Now, renewable diesel, which is synthetically, I should say the same as molecularly speaking with oil diesel versus biodiesel, which has water contact issues, can separate, doesn't have the same shelf life. So those were the three pieces. They happen to be green. They happen to fall under that umbrella. But when we look at things, we want to make sure that we pull away all government subsidies, because in our opinion, the government subsidies should pad the returns, not drive the returns. And that's how, when we're looking at this, we want to create something sustainable and something meaningful. But people used to push back on us, like how does fertilizer fall within energy infrastructure? And now you're starting to see how energy intensive fertilizer is, how many issues we have. And we want to show some slides on why this is going to continue. And one of the reasons why Soltec was such an important investment for us, given where our views are and where we think the world is heading. So when we just look at, and I think this is a great chart from the EPA, looking at national air pollutant concentration averages. So when we look at this, look at SO2, look at that sulfur. In the 90s, you can see where it was, and it had a steep drop off. Now, yes, acid rain was terrible for your home, for your car, for the rivers, ponds, lakes, but it was actually really good for the soil. It put sulfur back into the soil. Now, sulfur naturally occurs when you have the breakdown of agriculture waste. So if you leave some ag waste there, as it turns back into soil, and again, fertilizer, it can reintroduce some of the sulfur, but not all of it. And that's when you start looking at, and then you have plants that take a lot of sulfur. Typically, anything that has a yellow in it is going to take a decent amount of sulfur. So when you look at this, that we're constantly taking sulfur out of the soil and not really putting it back in. But if you look at just until 2006, really when we had that steep drop off, you were still seeing some sulfur getting put back into the soil. But since then, since 2006, we're currently in 2022, we've continued to see sulfur become a huge issue in terms of availability in soil, which is why we wanted to find a way to address this. Now, Soltec takes the molten sulfur from the processing of oil and natural gas and turns it into 100% renewable, 100% organic, 100% biodegradable, because it is micronized elemental sulfur. It's its most basic form. And it's important because it doesn't have sodium or salts. It doesn't have any types of mixtures with clay, because sulfates move in the soil. Sulfates are water soluble. Sulfur is not. So yes, if it rains after you put down the micronized sulfur, you'll have the sulfates that have been created by the bacteria, has not been absorbed by the plants, getting washed away, but that's a small amount. So you get a time release. And the reason why this is so important is because we need more fertilizers that stay in the soil. We don't have to worry about downstream contamination, but also increases the amount of yield and decreases the amount of water and the amount of other products that have to be used. One of them being obviously urea. So when we start looking at this, when you start looking at the products in general, we have a cost problem. The World Fertilizer Index from the IMF has rolled over, falling 10% from its recent peak, which nearly matched the 2008 great financial crisis. But it doesn't mean that it's going to continue to come down. And the reason why is because we have broad shortfalls. We have shortfalls because natural gas pricing, natural gas availability, and that's something that we're going to talk about in a minute. And so now Soltec, on the selfish side, in terms of our investment, reduces your need for nitrogen, potash, not so much on the phosphate side, but when you look at this, and it actually excels, because when you look at Soltec, they increase production and yield by anywhere between 20 and 40%, depending on weather conditions. The drier and wetter, the better they do, because again, when it's drier, you don't want to have to water your plants as much. And the sulfur and the sulfates in the soil help your plant really act at the optimal level by providing it with enough sulfur, enough sulfates that you don't need as much water. So again, trying to bring down cost as well as addressing the shortages, because it increases yield. It increases the caloric value of the product by giving it more oils. And that's what we need right now, because we have a food shortage. Now, as we prepare for our trip to London, where we'll be presenting at the World Ag Tech Forum, this is, I think, an important piece when you look at the SQR values and just the soil quality values within Europe. You know, the idea is using sulfur, using some of these other products, not just talking about Soltec, but other initiatives out there, to take some of that light green and turn it into dark green, or some of that yellow and turn it into light green, and try to breathe new life into some of these soils. Some of it, obviously, there's mountains, you know, some of that 0 to 20 is not going to be feasible, but there is a lot in there that we can work with and we can try to incentivize, because we have destroyed our soil. We have asked our soil to do so much without ever actually trying to replenish and do a lot of soil remediation, which is why there are initiatives out there to address that. But at the same time, you need to manage yield. You need to increase that, because we have a food problem. Now, when you look at the soaring gas prices hitting Europe, when you look at fertilizers and chemical side, so when you look at the cut, so far Europe has cut about 70% of fertilizer production, about 40 to 60% of petchem production, because of the availability of natural gas, not only to keep the pilot light on, but to also create stuff. You need to create hydrogen to do a cracking. You need to create, you need natural gas as an input to create ammonia and nitrogen and nitrates. So again, this availability problem is cutting flows. You're getting this adjustment where the availability is going to continue to be a problem at the worst point in time, because we need more product. We need more food. The U.S. isn't helping much with the drought increasing exponentially. You can see that about 70% of the country is under a drought, with about 40% of it being severe. Now, the Soltec product actually excels in drought formations, but this is not just the U.S. This is China. This is Europe. When we look at the Rhine River at the lowest levels in about 100 years. When you look at China, which is the worst drought since 1865, and the only reason why it stops at 1865 is because that's when the record started to be kept. So you have an availability problem. This is going to be the worst corn harvest since 2019 in the U.S. and the fourth worst over the last 20 years. This is coming where, and again, food shortages don't happen overnight. You have bumper crops, you have storage, you have silos, but they build on each other. And that's something that we're going to talk about at the end of this, on how this is built up since 2012, and now it's really starting to come to a head. Now, when we look at China, China's experiencing that worst heat wave. But if you remember, if you watch our shows from 2020, we were talking about how it was record flooding, and it was an 800-year flood. And the only reason why we know it was 800 years is because there was a Buddhist statue whose foot hadn't been touched. Again, just moving through the ages, hasn't been touched in 800 years. So we had a massive flooding event that destroyed livestock and crops, and now we have a massive drought that is destroying livestock and crops. And if you in your mind's eye can overlay these two pictures, you can see that the drought is happening at the most fertile part of China. Now, to be clear, China has 12% of the world's arable land, 22% of the world's population. And right now, all of the population, or a large part of the population, lives on that fertile area that is also being hit with the worst drought in recorded Chinese history. So when you overlay that, this is going to make things worse. 2020 made things worse because they had huge shortages because of flooding. Now they have huge shortages because of drought. And this is why they're in the market so aggressively buying, trying to absorb and trying to meet some of these needs. And when we look at the U.S. corn yield, as we were saying, one of the worst in the last since 2019. But look at how it's flattening out. And the problem that we're having right now is it started with a fish shortage. The fish shortage starting to ramp up, and large parts of Asia and and LATAM rely on fish. Well, what happens when you can't get fish? Well, you'll turn to chicken. And what happens if you can't get chicken? And it keeps going down that line. So then this is the typical breakdown. You start with beef. If you can't get beef, you go to pork. If you can't get pork, you go to chicken or fish, usually one and the same. And if you can't get that, you go to soybeans. If not that, corn or wheat, depending on the region you're in. And then the cheapest thing being rice. So when you look at the cost and the availability of livestock, you keep seeing that diminish. So what happened? We don't have fish, so we try to raise more chickens. If you crowd all these chickens in, then you get bird flu, and then bird flu spreads like wildfire. And then you have to cull the herd. Then you had swine flu culling the herd. And you have these rolling shortfalls, and there's nothing to backstop us. So now you have more and more reliance on grains, but yet you have stagnating yields. And I think it's important because you see the hockey stick from the 30s. You had the adoption of hybrid seeds, nitrogen fertilizers and herbicide, and off to the races. Then you started to flatline, and you started to see some of this cooling off, and then you had GMO plants. And GMO plants is ones that are made in lab, but also ones where you starve them of water. And then you take the plants that did the best and do that over and over again to get a drought-resistant seed. And then you had another little takeoff, and now we're flatlining again. And we're flatlining, but as this flatlines, as we lose chicken flocks, as we lose pig herds, as we lose yield, babies are still being born. The population is still growing, and that's creating underlying issues. And this is just taking into effect the rich, large marine ecosystem, which has been over-farmed. And this is one of the reasons why China has been so aggressive with the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, with the overfishing in Africa, because they need fish. And we've seen this starting to get worse and worse. And again, and not to say that overfishing started in 2012, because it didn't. It started to make headlines more and more because we were seeing the shortfalls and people relying on more. And if you remember, 2012 was a really weak year for yield. And so there was a fish problem and there was a food problem. And it was a matter of okay, well, there was enough bumper crops and things survived. But then as we continue, here you can see, China trying to move in on Taiwanese space, on Vietnamese space, which has created a lot of these issues. And this is why it's so important, because all of these nations, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, all rely heavily on fish. And as that drops down, they rely more on chicken. And then if they can't get any of that, they have to rely on rice and other imports, which are expensive. And this is creating, again, this knock-on effect that doesn't go away. So this is the 9-dash line, and it shouldn't be surprising that it takes in a significant amount of new fishing capacity as well as oil and gas fields, but food is more important at this point. And these are the clashes that have happened between the Chinese governments and varying fishing vessels throughout the region, and it's been over, again, fish. So free for all, 10 worst performing countries for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing scores. So again, China, we pick on China. They are not the only ones that are overfishing, which is why this is such a big problem. Taiwan, Cambodia, Russia, Vietnam. All of these entities are overfishing, but think about, I mean, not Taiwan at this point, but a lot of these countries are third world or emerging markets. And what do they need? They need cheap food. So they're trying to pull as much cheap food out of the ocean as possible, and whatever they can from the rice side, but it's causing lasting impacts. And it starts with fish, and it just compounds on itself, which is why we're in this situation. And as we said back in 2019, when the food crisis really started to take hold at the end of 19, we kept saying, like, look, this is a problem. And it's only going to get worse. And as we had a terrible harvest or a very weak harvest in 2020, and now we had another soft one in 21, leading to 2022, it compounds because people pull from storage, people pull from silos, and now we're in this food shortage. And based on what we're seeing, there isn't a bumper crop happening anytime soon. And even if there is, you have shortfalls in livestock in other areas, which again is minimizing how much we can rebuild, which is why we need fertilizers, and we need new types of fertilizers to address the coming shortfalls and the pain that's happening. Because if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, food is at the base. It forms the core, the foundation, and without food, people will go to war. And this is why we think it's so important, and we want to continue to invest and continue to drive, try to, again, pave that path forward of finding things, finding opportunities that not only meet a green score and an ESG initiative, but also do so and make money. And again, undercutting the current, because just based on the pricing at the moment, based on how we calculate it, Celtech's product is 20 to 40% more effective. It's also $1,400 to $1,600 cheaper per ton versus its alternative. Again, increasing its ability and its longevity. So that's what we have for you today. If you have any questions, again, you can find us in the comments section. I'm always happy to engage on Twitter or email, especially when it comes to something that we're as passionate about when it comes to food and ag and fertilizers in general, because there are a lot of things happening down in that world. And then we want to thank again Murray McLennan, CEO of Celtech, for joining us. And this is just a little bit on what's happening in the world today. So thanks for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.